Normandy, France, July 1944. The morning fog lay heavy over a field torn by weeks of shell fire. The air smelled of cordite wet soil, and the faint sweetness of crushed grass. In the shallow valley below, the hum of engines broke through the mist, slow, rhythmic, mechanical. Inside an American M4 Sherman, 5 men sat in silence. The metal walls around them quivered with each distant explosion. A 19-year-old gunner named Private Henry Lawson pressed his cheek against the gun sight, his hands trembling on the elevation wheel. He had fired only 3 live shells in training, none under fire. Then came the sound, low, guttural, unmistakable, German Panzers advancing through the haze. The commander shouted a range. The loader cursed as he slammed a shell home, and the gunner's heartbeat drowned out every word. Through the scope, dark shapes emerged. 4, maybe 5. The first shot whistled past. The second came closer, and before anyone could order, Lawson's hand tightened. A single panic burst of fire erupted. Smoke filled the turret, and outside something massive began to burn. By July 1944, the beaches of Normandy had been secured, but victory was far from certain. The Allies had pushed inland from Omaha and Utah, carving narrow corridors through hedgerow country that favored defense over attack. The German Wehrmacht had transformed every field, every village into a miniature fortress. Each hedgerow concealed mines, ambush positions, and anti-tank guns waiting in silence. The Americans called it the Green Hell. Progress was painfully slow. The 2nd Armored Division, 3rd Armored Division, and numerous infantry regiments fought not across open plains but through claustrophobic lanes. Dirt roads bounded by ancient hedges so high that tanks had to break through them nose first. Visibility was often no more than 30 yards. A single concealed gun could halt an entire column. Within this maze, the Germans deployed their best: Panzer IVs, Panther tanks, and the occasional Tiger Front, their armor thick and guns deadly. The Panzer units operated with experience and discipline, many crews veterans of Russia and North Africa. Against them were waves of American replacements. Young men with barely 8 weeks of training rushed to France to replace mounting losses. Inside a Sherman tank, fear was constant. The M4 was mechanically reliable and fast, but its armor was thin. German shells could penetrate from over 1,000 meters. The men inside knew it. They called their vehicle Ronson after the lighter brand because it lights up every time. Still, Shermans had advantages the Germans underestimated. Their turrets traversed faster. Their engines rarely failed. And above all, there were many more of them. When one was destroyed, another filled the gap within hours. It was a war of attrition and a test of nerves. Among these crews were countless young gunners who had never fired in anger before. Many had come from farms, garages, or factories. Average Americans who suddenly found themselves operating a 75mm cannon under fire. For every seasoned sergeant in a Sherman, there were 3 rookies learning by terror. The German counterattacks during Operation Cobra, beginning on July 25, 1944, turned parts of Normandy into a cauldron of armor-on-armor clashes. German forces, desperate to contain the Allied breakout, launched assaults wherever they spotted weakness. The U.S. 30th Infantry Division, the 3rd Armored, and elements of the 2nd Armored found themselves holding fragile lines against veteran Panzer Lehr and SS Panzer divisions. It was in this violent, fluid battlefield that one small event, a single gunner's reflex, would take place. A scene replayed thousands of times across France. 5 men sealed inside steel, their fate depending on a heartbeat. Henry Lawson, like many others, had arrived in France just 2 weeks earlier. Barely trained, still learning the feel of his gun, he was assigned as a replacement in a Sherman crew outside the town of St. Lo, one of the bloodiest sectors of the campaign. His commander, a battle-weary lieutenant, had survived since D-Day. The rest were new. The tension was always there. The knowledge that experience didn't guarantee survival, only delay the inevitable. When reports came of German armor regrouping to the east, the Shermans formed a defensive line at the edge of an orchard. The morning was quiet, almost deceptively peaceful. Then faintly at first came the grinding sound of engines and tracks through mud. The tankers knew what it meant. Panzer platoons, likely Panthers, were maneuvering to counterattack. Radio chatter turned sharp, clipped professional. Each man checked his task in silence. For Lawson, it was the moment every gunner feared and trained for, the split second when training meets terror. And that's where the chain of events leading to his panic burst began, an unplanned reflex born from fear, in a battlefield where hesitation could mean death. The M4 Sherman, the backbone of American armored forces, was a paradox of design. It was simple, dependable, and produced in vast numbers, but it was also outgunned by nearly every German tank it faced. Its 75mm M3 cannon could destroy a Panzer IV with a direct hit, but against a Panther or Tiger, it often needed to close the distance dangerously close. To the men who crewed it, the Sherman was both a lifeline and a coffin. It could carry them forward through shellfire, yet its thin armor meant that one well-placed round from a German 80mm gun could turn it into a furnace in seconds. The tanks burned because of their gasoline engines and ammunition storage. Only later in the war did the U.S. Army begin to add wet stowage, water-filled ammo racks that reduced the risk of explosion. But despite its weaknesses, the Sherman had a quality that no amount of German engineering could overcome. It was adaptable. Its gun stabilization system, though primitive by modern standards, allowed an American gunner to fire with surprising accuracy while the tank was moving. Its turret traverse speed, powered by hydraulics, was far faster than that of most Panzers, giving it an edge in fast reactions. It was this system that would play an unexpected role in what happened that morning near St. Lo. Tank combat in Normandy was brutally intimate. Battles rarely happened at long range. The hedgerows forced both sides into ambushes at 50 to 100 meters. Crews often spotted the enemy only seconds before firing. In those moments, survival came down not to rank or training but instinct. Whoever fired first usually lived. For rookie gunners like Lawson, training had focused on discipline, aim, breathe, fire, reload. But in real combat, discipline and panic often collided. The interior of a Sherman was a world of vibration and noise. The engine roaring behind, the commander shouting above, the loader slamming shells into the breech, the smell of oil and sweat thick in the air. Under that pressure, even trained soldiers could lose coordination. Veteran tank commanders often said that the first few seconds of an encounter decided everything. A calm gunner could line up a perfect shot. A panicked one might waste ammunition or hit something by accident that changed the entire outcome of a battle. Historically, many small unit victories in Normandy came down to these moments. In the chaos of Operation Cobra, American tanks ambushed German columns, sometimes by luck, sometimes by instinct. Crews who survived later admitted that what seemed like tactical brilliance was often pure reaction, muscle memory under terror. German Panzer crews, on the other hand, operated with precision. They trusted in their optics and armor. Their long-barreled 75mm and 88mm guns could penetrate a Sherman frontally at over a kilometer, but even they were vulnerable in the close hedgerow-laced terrain of France. A Sherman's speed and shorter turning radius made it a threat at close quarters. At St. Lo, the German counterattack that morning involved a platoon of Panzer IVs and Panther tanks, part of a reorganized Kampfgruppe, attempting to retake ground lost to the 3rd Armored Division. Their orders were simple: push through, cut the road, and stall the American advance. Lawson's unit, one of several Shermans positioned at the edge of the orchard, formed a thin defensive line. Each crewman knew that if the Panzers broke through, there was no cover, no retreat. When the German armor appeared through the mist, the young gunner's nerves tightened. His hand shook as he adjusted the sight. The commander called for calm. "Wait for range!" But in that split second, instinct overrode training. The recoil jolted through the tank and an unplanned burst of rounds fired before anyone had given the order. No one inside the tank could see the effect immediately. The smoke, the echo, and the shock filled every sense. But that burst might the panic burst and it would hit something that changed everything. And in the minutes that followed, that moment of reflex would determine whether the orchard at St. Lo became a graveyard of Shermans, or a triumph born from fear. The human angle, fear and instinct. Inside a tank for the men inside an American Sherman, battle was not a grand strategy. It was sound, vibration, and trust. The world outside the steel hull barely existed. The gunner saw through a scope the size of a coin. The driver saw through a slit of glass. Every man was confined to his duty, knowing that one mistake could end them all. Fear was constant but rarely admitted. Veterans later described it as a low hum that never stopped. Every time a tank halted, every time an engine cut out, the silence became unbearable, a signal that the enemy might be closer than they thought. Henry Lawson's fear that morning was no different from thousands of other young soldiers who entered battle for the first time. He was 19, inexperienced, but surrounded by others who pretended confidence. His commander barked orders not to assert control, but to drown out the sound of his own anxiety. When the panzers came through the mist, fear turned into instinct. The brain, overwhelmed by sensory overload, noise, motion, threat, switched to reflex. For Lawson, that reflex meant tightening his grip on the firing trigger just a second too soon. It was a mistake, but a human one. And in war, human errors sometimes produced results no plan could predict. That morning, it would save lives. The tactical angle, reaction over doctrine. Armored doctrine in 1944 stressed coordination. Tanks were to engage as teams, not as individuals. The commander identified targets, the gunner adjusted for range, the loader prepared the round, and the driver maintained position. It was a symphony of seconds, but in real combat, doctrine rarely survived contact with chaos. In the hedgerows, everything happened faster than headquarters could imagine. Enemy tanks appeared and vanished within moments. Radio interference was constant. Commanders made decisions by sound more than by sight. In these sudden encounters, reaction time meant survival. German crews with their superior optics often got the first shot. But if a Sherman could react within 3 seconds, the average reload time for its 75mm Panzer could deliver a crippling hit before the Panzer could fire again. Lawson's panic burst violated doctrine completely. Instead of waiting for range or command, he fired 3 rapid rounds in seconds. Yet this violation, born of fear, exploited the Sherman's advantage, speed. The turret, driven by hydraulics, could pivot and fire faster than the hand-cranked turrets of most German tanks. The German platoon, expecting a coordinated volley, hesitated when one Sherman suddenly opened up. That hesitation, even for a few seconds, broke their rhythm. In tank warfare, hesitation was fatal. The technological angle, the machine that forgave panic. The Sherman's greatest strength wasn't its armor or gun. It was its forgiveness. It could be mishandled and still perform. The automatic stabilizer helped keep the gun roughly on target, even when the tank was jolting over uneven ground. The transmission, though noisy, allowed quick repositioning. Its lightweight made it maneuverable in terrain that bogged down heavier panzers. When Lawson pulled the trigger early, the system worked in his favor. The gun's gyroscopic stabilizer kept the barrel steady enough for the first shot to find its mark. The second and third rounds, fired before the smoke cleared, benefited from the hydraulic traverse's speed, allowing the gun to correct position faster than any German tank could react. In technical reports after the war, Allied engineers often remarked that the Sherman's design allowed average men to achieve above-average results. It was a machine that compensated for fear and inexperience. It was never meant to outgun the Panzer. It was meant to outfight it through efficiency. That was precisely what happened in that orchard. The young gunner's mistake, filtered through American engineering and battlefield randomness, became a weapon of its own. The combination of human fear, mechanical design, and split-second reaction created a moment no manual could have predicted. The smoke of battle had not yet cleared, but the dynamics of that encounter, human emotion, tactical chaos, and machine resilience, were already shaping what would follow. The Germans were regrouping, the Americans bracing, and in the next phase, what began as panic would ignite into a full armored clash. The German angle. Confidence before confusion. For the German Panzer crews advancing toward St. Lo that morning, the battlefield felt familiar. They had faced Allied tanks before, and slower, less trained, and usually at a disadvantage. Their orders were clear. Move in line, crush resistance, and secure the crossroads before noon. The lead tank, likely a Panzer IV AOS of UH, carried a crew of veterans from the Eastern Front. Their commander, a Feldwebel named Otto Reinhardt, had fought in Ukraine and Poland. He trusted his armor, his optics, and his gunner's precision. Against Shermans, he had every reason to. As they advanced through the fog, German discipline showed. Each tank maintained interval, guns ready. To the right, a Panther provided overwatch. Their coordination was mechanical, rehearsed, until the first Sherman opened fire far earlier than expected. The first American shell struck low, glancing off the frontal armor. The second found the turret ring. It was a blind shot, the kind that only happened when fear replaced calculation, but luck and timing aligned. The explosion blew open the turret seam, igniting the ammunition inside. For the German crews behind Reinhardt, the sight was horrifying. The lead tank erupted in flame, its ammunition cooking off in violent bursts. Radio calls turned to static and shouting. Some thought the Americans had hidden artillery. Others assumed air cover. Confusion spread. The Panzer Platoon halted, the one thing their training forbade. And in those frozen seconds, the Americans reloaded. From the German perspective, that single unplanned burst of fire shattered an entire formation's confidence. Even hardened veterans could lose cohesion when the expected order of battle collapsed. One act of chaos had rippled outward, breaking discipline faster than any Allied ambush could have. Leadership under chaos inside the Sherman. The commander's voice had cut through the ringing in their ears. He didn't praise or scold him, he simply gave the next order. That was leadership in its rawest form. No lectures, no panic, just direction. In tank warfare, leadership was rarely about bravery. It was about composure under confusion. A good commander didn't eliminate fear. He redirected it. When the panic burst hit, Lawson's commander had a choice: discipline the rookie or seize the opportunity. He chose the latter. Reload, he ordered. Stay on that smoke. Those words, calm, measured, anchored the crew back into function. The loader obeyed. The driver adjusted position, and within seconds the Sherman was firing again, this time with precision. Across the battlefield, similar acts of leadership determined survival. In the German ranks, confusion at the loss of the lead tank broke command flow. Without visibility or clear orders, subordinate tanks hesitated. Radios crackled, men argued, and what had been an organized advance turned into hesitation, the deadliest weakness on any battlefield. It wasn't superior numbers that often won these duels. It was the ability to recover faster from shock. The moral angle, panic, luck, and the line between in war, success often disguises the truth. Reports would later call it a decisive action or rapid engagement. But inside the tank, everyone knew it hadn't been skill alone. It was fear, raw, involuntary, and very human. The moral tension of such moments haunted many soldiers after the war. How could something born from panic become heroism? How could blind fear lead to survival while others, calm and disciplined, perished? Historians studying armored warfare note that luck often determined outcomes more than tactics did. But luck wasn't random. It favored those who acted even in confusion. Lawson's panic burst was an instinctive response to threat, not a calculated decision. Yet its effect was indistinguishable from tactical brilliance. For the men who survived that day, it became an uneasy legend. Some saw it as proof that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the ability to function within it. Others, especially Lawson himself, felt no pride. He later described it simply as a mistake that happened to work. Morally, it blurred the line between heroism and accident. In the grand machinery of war, history rarely records the trembling hands or racing heartbeat behind a victory. It records only the outcome. And so, as smoke drifted over the orchard at St. Lo, and the burning silhouette of a Panzer cast flickering shadows through the fog, what began as panic was already being written, in after-action reports, in memory, and in myth, as valor. That confusion and redefinition of fear would soon escalate into the full battle, the climax, when the German counterattack struck back and the Americans had to hold under fire. The first shell had already found its mark. A German Panzer burned in the distance, its flames visible even through the smoke and morning haze. The explosion shook the ground and rattled every Sherman in the line. Inside Lawson's tank, no one spoke. The commander's headset filled with broken radio chatter, reports of enemy armor, calls for artillery, voices cutting in and out through static. Then came the unmistakable whine of enemy rounds slicing the air. The Panzers were firing back. A shell struck the ground just short of their position, throwing up dirt and fragments that clattered against the hull. The driver cursed and reversed half a meter, The gunner readjusted and the loader forced another round into the breech. The tank shook again as the main gun fired, the recoil driving the barrel back like a piston. Outside, the orchard had become a storm. Smoke from burning vehicles mixed with the mist. Flames licked through the hedgerows, turning the air metallic and suffocating. The sound was relentless. The clanging of tracks, the thud of shells, and the muffled shouts over radio and intercom. Lawson couldn't tell which tank was which anymore. His periscope was clouded with smoke, his ears numb from concussion. Yet his hands moved on their own. Traverse, aim, fire. Every motion drilled into him during training now happened faster than thought. To the right, another Sherman took a hit. The explosion blew open its turret, sending debris skyward. The commander's voice screamed through the radio, then went silent. For a moment, everyone in Lawson's tank froze. The sense of mortality hit like a wave. The lieutenant's voice broke the paralysis. "Keep firing!" And so they did. Through gaps in the haze, Lawson caught sight of movement. The silhouette of another Panzer turning its gun toward them. He didn't wait, he fired. The first round went high, the second low. The third, a high explosive shell, struck the base of the Panzer's hull near the tracks. A flash of light, then an orange bloom. The German tank stopped moving. Its turret sagged, smoke curling from the hatches. Whether it was destroyed or just disabled didn't matter. It was no longer firing. By now, the entire defensive line was engaged. American tanks were firing point blank across the hedgerows, some shells missing by inches, others ricocheting into the air. The air smelled of fuel and iron. Lawson's panic burst had done more than kill one tank. It had broken the German formation. Without their lead vehicle, the Panzers had no clear field of advance. Their tight formation dissolved into isolated duels, each crew fighting alone. The Germans responded with discipline. One Panther tried to flank left, moving through a narrow lane between hedgerows. But an M10 tank destroyer hidden behind a barn fired and struck its turret clean through. The sound was deafening. For several minutes, the battlefield became a blur of action and reaction, tanks shifting, firing, reversing, advancing. No one truly commanded the fight. It unfolded in fragments, each decision shaping the next. Inside Lawson's Sherman, the crew worked like a machine. The loader's arms bled from scraping metal. The commander's eyes darted from periscope to radio. The gunner's world had shrunk to crosshairs and smoke. Each shot was deafening. Each hit brought a new vibration through the floor. The tank's interior was sweltering, the metal walls radiating heat from the gun's constant firing. Sweat mixed with oil on their faces. Then came the sound none of them wanted to hear. The hiss of a German round hitting close, followed by a sharp crack against the side armor. The impact dented the hull, showering the crew with dust and paint. The driver shouted, the commander swore, and Lawson instinctively swung the turret toward the source. Through the scope, he saw it, another Panzer barely 60 meters away, its gun lowering directly toward them. Lawson didn't think. He fired. The recoil slammed him backward and the shell tore through the air, hitting the German tank just as it fired. The two explosions seemed to merge, a blinding flash that shook the ground and sent debris raining over the orchard. When the smoke cleared seconds later, both tanks were silent. The German's gun drooped, flames flickering from the turret. The Sherman, battered but intact, stood amid the ruin. In those few chaotic minutes, the line had held. What began as a reflexive burst of fear had turned into a decisive stand, one that no strategy could have planned, and no officer could have commanded. As the flames died and the battlefield quieted, the crew realized they had survived, but the fight wasn't over. The Germans were regrouping beyond the ridge, preparing for another assault. The calm between barrages was only temporary. The true test, the second wave Syrian was about to begin. The lull lasted less than 5 minutes. Then the distant rumble started again, and faint at first, then unmistakable. The Germans were coming back. From the tree line ahead, new shapes emerged, darker, heavier, slower. These weren't light panzers anymore. They were Panther tanks, their sloped armor gleaming under the midday sun, their 75mm guns poised like iron spears. Lawson's commander whispered under his breath, "They've brought the big ones." The American line was thin now. Several Shermans were disabled, their tracks broken or turrets jammed. Men worked frantically to repair radios, reload ammunition, and reposition behind cover. Infantry with bazookas crawled into ditches. knowing they might be the last defense if the tanks broke through. In the still air before the next clash, the young gunner could hear everything: the rasp of his own breathing, the ticking of the engine, the metallic ping of cooling shells beside his feet. His hands shook, his heart pounded. Yet somewhere in that chaos a kind of focus took hold, a soldier's clarity that comes only when there's no room for thought. "Range 200. The commander shouted. "Loaded," came the reply. "Fire!" The first round slammed into a Panther's glacis plate and bounced off. Sparks showered across its front armor, but the tank didn't stop. It kept moving, firing as it advanced. A German shell hit the ground just ahead of Lawson's tank, the blast shaking loose dust and fragments inside the turret. The loader coughed, grabbed another shell, and jammed it home. "Loaded!" He yelled again, voice hoarse from smoke. Lawson adjusted his aim and fired. This time the shell struck just under the enemy's turret ring, a vulnerable spot. The explosion was sharp, contained, but enough. Flames burst from the hatch, followed by a plume of black smoke. The Sherman crew cheered for a second, then ducked as another shell screamed overhead. 2 more Panthers pushed forward, one veering left to flank, another holding steady in the center. The Americans fired repeatedly, shells skipping off the thick frontal armor. From somewhere behind, an M10 tank destroyer fired a high-velocity round. It struck clean. The lead Panther erupted in a fireball that rocked the entire field, but the flanking tank was still moving. It cut through the orchard, knocking down trees as it circled toward the American right. Lawson's tank couldn't turn fast enough. The turret traverse was too slow. "We'll never get him in time," the driver yelled. Then over the radio another voice broke in. "Hold your fire, we've got him." A Sherman from the next hedgerow fired point blank, catching the Panther in its side armor. The explosion tore through its ammunition rack, sending the turret spinning into the air. The crew in Lawson's tank stared as the flaming wreck rolled to a stop. Silence again, the kind that never feels real. For a moment, the battlefield looked frozen. Twisted steel, black smoke, and the strange quiet that follows sudden violence. The Germans had stopped their advance. What remained of their platoon was retreating, some tanks reversing into the cover of the woods, others abandoned and burning. Inside Lawson's Sherman, the men slumped against the steel walls, drenched in sweat and disbelief. The commander removed his headset and muttered, "They're pulling back." But the victory felt hollow. The orchard was a graveyard now, 6 tanks on fire, the ground cratered and strewn with debris. The cost had been enormous. Over the radio, battalion command confirmed it. The German counterattack had been blunted. The ridge was still in American hands. Reinforcements were en route, but too late to matter. The rookies had held the line. For Henry Lawson, it hadn't felt like heroism. His body still trembled from the recoil. His ears rang with every echo of the gun. He didn't remember aiming or choosing, only surviving. Yet reports later showed that his rapid, uncoordinated panic burst in that moment of raw fear had destroyed the 1st Panzer in the column, blocking the road and forcing the entire German formation to break apart. In that chaos, their coordinated assault dissolved, allowing the Americans to fight piecemeal and hold the position. In the grand scale of war, it was a small event, a forgotten clash in the vast Normandy campaign, but for those who were there, it was everything. As the evening light fell across the field, the smoke thinned and the sound of engines faded. The American tanks, battered and blackened, stood like sentinels over a landscape of ruin. The men inside said little. They just watched the horizon, waiting for orders that never came. The battle, at least for now, was over. When the last echo of artillery died across the Normandy hedgerows, the battlefield seemed to exhale. The roar of engines was replaced by the hiss of burning metal, the drip of oil, and the low groans of the wounded. For the 3rd Armored Division, the engagement was officially recorded as a successful defense under extreme duress. The reports listed material losses, ammunition expenditure, and enemy casualties, all in neat clinical lines. But for the men who lived through it, those columns of data felt meaningless. The field was still smoking, and the air was thick with the metallic scent of burnt steel and cordite. Henry Lawson's tank stood silent at the edge of the orchard, its paint scorched, its treads half buried in churned mud. The gun barrel, still warm, pointed toward a line of ruined German armor. Panzers and Panthers alike blackened and twisted from the fire. Medics moved between the wrecks, pulling survivors from both sides. Some German crewmen stumbled out of their destroyed tanks, faces gray with ash and disbelief. American soldiers guided them gently toward makeshift aid stations. Enemies moments ago, now just men broken by the same fury. In the company's after-action log, Lawson's name appeared only once: gunner, effective fire under duress. It didn't mention panic. It didn't mention the error that had started it all. Yet among the crews, the story spread quickly. How a 19-year-old rookie had fired too soon. How that first shell had jammed a Panzer on the road and turned the tide. Veterans called it luck. Others said it was proof that instinct, even born of fear, had its place in war. By afternoon, engineers arrived to clear the wreckage. Bulldozers pushed twisted tanks into shallow ditches. Burned-out hulks were marked with chalk and photographed for intelligence reports. Each destroyed Panzer was a trophy for the broader campaign. Evidence that the German armor, once feared unstoppable, could now be beaten head-on. But there was no celebration among the crews. They sat quietly beside their tanks, cleaning weapons, smoking cigarettes, or writing short letters home. The victory didn't feel like triumph. It felt like survival. The field itself was a reminder of how fragile that survival was. Every Sherman hit, every cratered trench, told the same story, that the margin between life and death in Normandy was measured not in bravery, but in seconds. When evening fell, a light rain began to fall, soft at first, then steady. Steam rose from the wrecks as water hit the hot metal. The ground turned dark and heavy, swallowing footprints and blood alike. Lawson stepped out of the turret for the first time in hours. His face was pale, streaked with soot. He looked across the field where medics were covering bodies with tarps. Some wore German uniforms. Some didn't. His commander came up beside him, silent for a moment. "Hell of a shot, kid," he finally said. Lawson didn't answer. He just nodded, eyes fixed on the distance. Later, in the regimental debrief, higher command emphasized the importance of disciplined initiative, the ability to act decisively when communication breaks down. The phrase became doctrine, written into the post-battle analysis. Ironically, it had all started with a moment of pure, undisciplined fear. In the days that followed, new orders came down: push east toward St. Lo, secure the next ridgeline, and keep moving. There was no pause for reflection. The war machine turned and the men followed. But for Lawson, something had changed. The smell of burning fuel, the image of that first Panzer erupting in fire, it stayed with him. He would never again see battle as a contest of courage or skill. It was, in his mind, a collision of accidents, where survival depended as much on timing and machine as on any man's will. That truth, more than the official reports or medals, was what defined the real aftermath of Normandy. The next phase would move beyond the field itself, tracing how this single small encounter fit into the larger evolution of armored warfare, and how it reshaped both American and German tactics in the final year of the war. In military history, some moments are recorded not because of their scale, but because of what they reveal. The firefight at that Normandy orchard was one of thousands of nameless engagements fought in June 1944, yet its lessons echoed far beyond the hedgerows. When after-action reports reached division headquarters, officers noted that the German counterattack had failed, not due to superior numbers or firepower, but because of disrupted coordination. One jammed Panzer on the narrow road had stalled the entire formation, the same tank Lawson had hit in his initial panic burst. In the claustrophobic terrain of Normandy, such minor disruptions often meant total tactical collapse. American analysts began to recognize this pattern. They called it localized chaos advantage, the idea that quick, unorthodox reactions by individual crews could destabilize even superior enemy forces. It was an early recognition of decentralized command thinking, a doctrine that would later shape NATO training during the Cold War. For the Germans, the Orchard Battle was another entry in a growing list of frustrations. The Panther, though technologically advanced, had once again been defeated by terrain, logistics, and timing. Its armor was superior, but its bulk made it vulnerable in tight country roads where mobility mattered more than protection. Engineers at Panzer Lehr Division would later admit that the enemy's speed and disregard for formality gave American tankers an edge that numbers alone couldn't measure. By late summer 1944, the myth of the invincible Panzer was fading. Reports from frontline units described tank crews abandoning damaged vehicles faster than before, knowing replacement parts were scarce and Allied air power unrelenting. The aura of technical supremacy that once defined the Wehrmacht's armored corps was slowly replaced by exhaustion and fatalism. Meanwhile, for American crews, the psychological tide had shifted. Confidence began to replace fear. The Sherman, often derided as undergunned, had proven adaptable, forgiving, and quick. Crews learned to exploit its mobility, to strike first, move fast, and never engage on the enemy's terms. The doctrine of aggression, not armor, became the soul of Allied tank warfare. When U.S. Army historians compiled the official records of the Normandy campaign in 1946, the action at the Orchard was mentioned only in passing, a minor defensive encounter south of Isigny. No names, no heroics. Yet for the veterans of that platoon, it was the day they learned what war truly was. A convergence of fear, chance, and machinery. Henry Lawson returned home after the war, decorated but quiet about his service. In letters to fellow crewmen years later, he described that morning as a blur of smoke and light, something that just happened. He never called it courage. He never called it victory. To him, it was luck that lasted just long enough. Historians now view these moments, the unscripted, chaotic flashes of instinct, as the true heart of armored warfare in Normandy. The myth of perfect coordination or flawless planning collapses under the weight of what the veterans recalled: mud, confusion, and the constant sound of shells that never stopped falling. And yet, out of that chaos, patterns emerged. The U.S. Army refined its combined arms tactics. Commanders learned to trust the judgment of individual tankers even in isolation. By the time Allied forces reached the Siegfried Line, the lessons of Normandy had become doctrine. Quick thinking under pressure, even if born of panic, was now recognized as a weapon in itself. In retrospect, that single burst of gunfire in a rain-soaked orchard represented more than survival. It symbolized the turning point in how modern armies viewed control and chaos. The realization that war was not mastered by perfect machines or flawless discipline, but by the unpredictable instincts of men forced to decide within seconds. For every tank left burning in Normandy, there was a story like Lawson's behind it, small, human, and unrecorded. Yet together they formed the invisible architecture of victory. And as the smoke of that forgotten battle faded into history, one truth remained. Sometimes the future of a war can turn not on strategy or command, but on a single frightened gunner's pull of the trigger. War remembers its victories in numbers: tanks destroyed, ground gained, medals awarded. But what it often forgets are the seconds in which those victories were decided. Seconds when fear, chance, and instinct intertwined so tightly that no soldier could tell them apart. Henry Lawson's panic burst was never written into history books. It was a moment buried in the noise of greater battles, overshadowed by names and operations that filled maps and timelines. Yet within that instant, the trembling hands, the uncalculated decision, the streak of fire through mist, lay the essence of the human experience in war. He was not a hero in the cinematic sense. He was a 19-year-old gunner trying not to die. And that perhaps is the truest reflection of courage, not the absence of fear, but the act of continuing despite it. The battle at the Orchard revealed something timeless about warfare: that it is not the cold perfection of machines that wins wars, but the fragile, flawed reactions of people caught within them. The Sherman tank, forgiving and unremarkable on paper, became deadly because it allowed ordinary men to make mistakes and still prevail. In that sense, the American war machine was not built only of steel, but of adaptability, a belief that imperfection could still lead to triumph. And that belief, multiplied across thousands of soldiers and crews, became the quiet force that carried the Allies through Europe. Decades later, historians would call Normandy a triumph of logistics and strategy. But for the men who lived it, the truth was simpler. Survival came down to instinct. A second too early, a second too late. That was the line between life and death. Henry Lawson survived the war, but the sound of that first shot, his mistake, never left him. In letters written years later, he said he still dreamed of the orchard, of smoke rising through the trees, of the silence that followed. In that silence lies the true story of war, not the glory, not the victory, but the small trembling decisions that shaped history itself.